A body hit the stone floor of the throne hall. Then another. Then a third. Servants dragged the dead through the iron doors before the dawn bells could ring. 800 years, and not one season of peace. Every consort dead by morning. Every advisor drained at the long table. Every bonded servant cold before their first moon ended. The court called it the bloodlust. The villagers called it the curse. The king himself called it hunger. And on the night this story begins, a wagon stopped at the iron gate. A girl stepped out. Early 20s. One eye white as milk. A scar across her throat where a voice used to be. She did not cry. She did not flinch. She did not run. She carried a small iron flask in her left hand. Her name was Leora. And she was not afraid. Stay with me on this one. The wagon driver would not look at her as he turned the horses. He had been paid in silver to deliver one body to the gate. He did not expect to deliver a living one back to the village. He had delivered 19 girls before her. 19 wagons. 19 sets of empty clothes the next morning, folded by the door, returned without a word. The villagers had stopped naming the girls after the 7th. It was easier that way. The mothers stopped weaving them new dresses after the 12th. The priests stopped blessing the road after the 15th. Leora was the 20th. The village council had not voted on her. The village council had not needed to. She had walked into the council hall the morning after her mother's burial. She had laid the iron flask on the long oak bench. She had pointed to her own chest. She had nodded once. The council had argued for an hour. Then the head councilman had set down his cup and said, "If the girl says she goes, the girl goes." So when Leora climbed down from the wagon in her mother's old gray dress, no one waved goodbye. There was no one left to wave. The mother who had taught her every word in the hunter's blue book was 3 weeks in the cold ground. The father had died of the cough when she was a child. The grandmother who had once held a knife to the king's throat had been a name on a page in the family Bible for 200 years. Leora walked to the iron gate and waited. The gate was twice her height. Black metal. 2 ravens carved into the bars. A chain across the lock thick enough to hold a bull. She did not knock. She did not call out. She simply stood with the iron flask in her left hand and waited for the court to notice her. They noticed her after the moon rose. 2 figures came down the long path from the keep. Pale faces. Black robes. They moved without sound. One of them was the head advisor. The other was a woman who had been a duchess once, long before she stopped breathing. They stopped on the other side of the iron gate and looked at her with hollow, patient eyes. The advisor spoke first. He asked her name. She did not answer. He asked again, louder. She lifted her chin and tapped her throat. He understood. The duchess smiled the kind of smile that made the village children dream of teeth for a week. She unlocked the gate. The chain fell against the stone with a sound like a body dropping. Leora stepped inside. The gate closed behind her. The advisor walked ahead. The duchess walked behind. Leora walked in the middle, the iron flask still in her hand. They led her up the long path. Past the dry fountain. Past the chapel where no one prayed anymore. Past the rose garden that bloomed only in black. Past a low stone bench where the village women whispered no living woman had ever rested. Past the old well that the duchess told the children of the keep was bottomless and dry. To the throne hall. The hall was the size of a small church. Stone vaults overhead. Candles in iron sconces. A long table down the middle, set for a feast that never happened. And at the far end, on a chair carved from one piece of black oak, sat the king. He did not stand when she entered. Kings rarely do. He watched her cross the long stone floor with the patience of something that has waited 800 years for the next meal. His hair was the color of wet ash. His eyes were the color of old wine. His hands rested on the arms of the chair, long and still, the nails the color of bone. The advisor stopped 10 paces from the throne. The Duchess stopped with him. Leora kept walking. She walked until she was 3 paces from the king. Then she knelt. Then she stood up again. She did not bow her head. She set the iron flask on the floor between them. She reached into her sleeve and pulled out a piece of white chalk. She bent down and wrote one sentence on the black stone floor in plain hunter's script. The advisor read it first. His face did not move because his face could no longer move. But his eyes flickered. The Duchess read it next and stepped back without meaning to. The king read it last. He read it twice. The sentence on the floor said this: "You will feed from me on my terms by my mother's covenant, or you will starve." The king looked at the sentence for a long time. Then he looked at Leora. Then he laughed. The laugh was not loud. It was the sound of a door opening in a house no one had lived in for 100 years. The advisor laughed with him, because the advisor always laughed when the king laughed. The Duchess did not laugh. She was watching Leora's hands. Leora's hands were steady. The king leaned forward in the black oak chair. He spoke for the first time. His voice was quiet. He said, "No one has spoken my mother's covenant aloud in 200 years. He said, "The last hunter who tried to invoke it lost her tongue before she finished the first word." Then he looked at Leora's scarred throat and his face changed. He said, "Who taught you to write that sentence?" Leora pulled a folded paper from her sleeve. She held it out. The advisor took it from her hand with 2 pale fingers and carried it to the throne. The king unfolded it. It was a marriage page from a hunter's family Bible. The names on it were old. The seal at the bottom was older. The blood that sealed it was dry but unmistakable. The king read the name at the top of the page. He read it twice. Then he set the page down on the arm of the chair and looked at Leora for a long, quiet moment. He said, "Your grandmother." Leora nodded once. He said, "Your grandmother held a knife to my throat in this hall 200 years ago." Leora nodded once. He said, "Your grandmother is the only living thing that ever made me lower my eyes." Leora did not nod. She tapped the iron flask with her shoe. The king understood. He stood up from the black oak chair. The advisor flinched. The Duchess took another step back. The king walked down from the dais. He stopped 1 pace from Leora. He was a head and a half taller than her. He smelled of cold iron and old smoke. He looked down at her milky eye and her scarred throat and the iron flask at her feet. He said, "The covenant says I drink only what is poured." He said, "The covenant says I drink only what is freely given." He said, "The covenant says if I take more than I am given, I starve." He said, "The covenant says the signatory is the only mouth that names the measure." He said, "The covenant says the king cannot ask twice." He said, "The covenant says the king cannot beg." Leora nodded once for each line. Then she bent down. She unstoppered the iron flask. She rolled up her left sleeve. She drew a small clean cut across the inside of her wrist with a hunter's blade no one had seen her draw. She let exactly 9 drops fall into the flask. She corked it. She held it up to him. The king took the flask. He drank what was in it. He did not take more. He set the flask back in her hand. He bowed his head 1/2 inch. The advisor stared. The Duchess stared. The king walked back to the black oak chair and sat down. He said, "Take her to the West Tower." He said, "Do not touch her." He said, "Do not test her." The Duchess opened her mouth to argue. The king lifted 1 finger. The Duchess closed her mouth. Leora picked up the flask. She walked out of the hall with the Duchess behind her and the advisor behind the Duchess. She was the first living thing to leave the throne hall on her own feet in 200 years. The West Tower had 1 window. The window faced east. Leora liked that. She set the flask on the sill where the first dawn light would touch it. She washed her hands in cold water from the stone basin. She lit 1 beeswax candle. She sat down on the edge of the narrow bed. She did not sleep. She pulled the hunter's blue book from the inside pocket of her dress. She read the page her mother had marked. She read it 3 times. She closed the book. She put it under the pillow. She watched the candle burn down by one finger. The keep was very quiet. Somewhere far below, a stone shifted in a wall and a small dry sound went up the tower. She did not flinch. She had survived the first night. The council doors slammed open before the second bell. 6 advisors, iron stakes in their hands. The head advisor at the front, his face finally moving now, twisted around one word. "Hunter," he said. "We knew it. Hold on to that detail." They had been waiting outside her door since the first bell. They had voted while she washed her hands. The vote had been 6-0. The covenant was the king's leash, not theirs. They were not bound by it. They could kill her in the corridor before he ever heard her name spoken aloud again. The head advisor raised his iron stake. Leora did not move from the edge of the bed. She lifted her left hand and tapped her throat and shook her head once. Then she pulled the folded paper from her sleeve again and held it out the way you hold out bread to a starving dog. The Duchess, who had not gone with the council, who had stayed in the corridor behind them, stepped forward and took the paper. She read it aloud for the council to hear. She read every line. She read the seal. She read the blood. And she read the part the king had not read aloud the night before. The covenant did not only bind the king. The covenant bound every member of his court who had drunk from a hunter's daughter under the old roof. Every advisor in that room had drunk from a hunter's daughter at least once in the last 800 years. The Duchess looked up from the page. The head advisor's iron stake lowered by one slow inch. He understood. He understood before the others. He said, "She is bound to all of us." The Duchess said no. She said, "We are bound to her." The council went very still in the way only dead things can go still. There is a stillness in a living body. It is small and uncertain and full of motion at the edges. The stillness of a dead body that has been pretending to live for 800 years is a different kind. It is heavy. It is the stillness of a stone that has been thinking the same thought for centuries. That stillness filled the corridor. The head advisor lowered the iron stake all the way. The 5 behind him lowered theirs together. Leora stood up from the bed. She walked past them into the corridor. They did not stop her. She walked down the long stair. She walked through the cold gallery, where the old portraits watched her with eyes that had been painted before her grandmother's grandmother was born. She walked into the throne hall. The king was already on his feet. He had heard the doors. He had heard the council's footsteps stop. He had heard the silence after. He looked at her, and his old wine eyes were not the same as last night. Last night he had looked at her like a curiosity. Now he looked at her like a verdict. She crossed the long stone floor. She stopped 3 paces from the throne. She knelt on her left knee, not in worship, but to make herself shorter than him for what came next. She pulled the chalk from her sleeve. She wrote names on the black stone floor. She wrote them slowly. She wrote 19 names. Each name was a girl from her village. Each name was a wagon. Each name was an empty dress folded by the door. Then she kept writing. She wrote 40 more names. Then 60. Then 100. Names of consorts. Names of advisors' daughters. Names of bonded servants. Names the court had forgotten. Names the court had never spoken aloud. By the time she stopped writing, the entire stone floor was white with chalk. Some of the names were small and tight in the corners. Some of the names were big, written with the side of the chalk, in the script a child uses before she has learned to make her letters small. Some of the names had no last name. Some of the names had no first name. Some of the names were only initials and a year. The king read every name. He read for a long time. He stood up from the throne, once to read the names along the far wall. He sat back down to read the names near his own feet. When he finished, he sat back down in the black oak chair like a man whose legs had stopped holding him. If you are still with me, hit that subscribe button. It tells me you want the rest of these. Because the next part is the part the court did not survive. Leora stood up. She walked to the long table where the dead consorts had sat. She pulled out the chair at the head of the table. The chair that had not been sat in by a living thing in 200 years. She sat down in it. The advisors filed in behind her. The Duchess came last. They all stood at the table. The king watched her sit at the head of his own table. He did not stop her. Then she did the thing that broke the court. She lifted her left hand. She made the small, steady gesture every hunter's daughter is taught before her 6th birthday. 3 fingers down. 1 finger up. It was the gesture her grandmother had used in this hall 200 years before. The gesture meant the covenant is now active in every room of this house, not only at the king's lips. Every dead thing in that hall felt it. Every dead thing in that hall lowered its eyes. Every dead thing except the king. He smiled. The smile was not the laugh from the night before. It was something older. He stood up from the black oak chair. He walked the length of the long table. He stopped at her left shoulder. He said, "My lady." He said it the way men used to say it to queens before there were countries. The advisors held their breath, which they did not need to do, but they did it out of old habit. The Duchess closed her eyes. The next night the king summoned the full court. The full court had not been summoned in 140 years. They came from the lower halls and the blood cellar and the chapel and the long galleries. They came in their old clothes and their old jewels and their old faces. 200 of them. They filled the throne hall from the dais to the iron doors. They stood in rows like a forest of pale trees. The king sat on the black oak chair. Leora stood at his right hand. She wore her mother's gray dress, washed clean of the road. The iron flask was at her belt. The chalk was in her sleeve. The king rose. He spoke. His voice carried to the back of the hall, the way only an 800-year-old voice can carry. He said, "The covenant of the hunter's house is alive again." He said, "The last signatory stands at my right hand." He said, "You will treat her as the seal of my house." He said it 3 times, so no one could pretend not to have heard. Then he sat down. The court was very quiet. And then his bloodlust rose. It was not a thing he could stop. 800 years of hunger does not bow because a king tells it to. His eyes darkened. His hands tightened on the arms of the chair until the black oak made a small dry sound. He stood up again. He stepped down from the dais. He took 1 step toward Leora. Then another. The advisors did not move. The Duchess did not move. No one in the court moved. Because they had seen this exact walk 132 times. They had seen the end of it every single time. Leora did not step back. She did the opposite. She stepped forward. She walked to meet him. She stopped 1 pace away. She lowered herself down. She knelt. She tilted her head to one side. She offered him her throat. The court drew in a breath as one. 200 dead chests filled with air they did not need. The candles in the iron sconces guttered once together, as if even the flame remembered the last 132 times this had ended. The king lifted his hand. He brushed her hair away from the scar on her neck. He bent his face down to her throat. His mouth opened. His old fangs touched her skin. The Duchess took 1 step forward and then stopped herself. The head advisor closed his eyes. Now here's the thing. He could not bite. The covenant held. The covenant held the way iron holds heat. The way old stone holds cold. The way a mother's word holds across 200 years. His mouth was on her throat, and he could not close it. He stood there for what felt like a long time. The court watched him stand there. The candles burned down by a full finger. The Duchess later said it lasted the length of a hymn. The head advisor later said it lasted the length of a prayer. The youngest of the bonded, who had only been turned 40 years before, later said it lasted the length of a heartbeat she had not had in 40 years. Leora did not move. She had known this would happen. She had known it before she stepped down from the wagon. She had known it before her mother died. She had known it the first time her grandmother taught her the 3 fingers down and 1 finger up. The king pulled his mouth away from her throat. He stood very straight. His old wine eyes looked at her with something that had not been in his eyes for 800 years. It was not love. It was something earlier than love. It was the look a king gives the only person in the world who has ever been able to tell him no. Then he did the thing the court had never seen any king do. He dropped to 1 knee. He kept the knee on the cold black stone for a long moment. He lowered his head. He said, "My lady," 3 more times, each one quieter than the last. The court watched their king kneel. And then in rows, from the dais to the iron doors, 200 dead things lowered themselves to the floor. The advisors knelt. The duchess knelt. The servants knelt. The old portraits in the galleries did not kneel because they could not, but the painted eyes lowered. The dry fountain in the courtyard cracked at the base. The roses in the black garden opened 1 inch wider than they had opened in 200 years. Leora stood up. She put her left hand on top of the king's bowed head. She did not press down. She did not lift him up. She simply rested her hand there for the count of 10. The court did not raise its eyes during the count. The candles did not gutter again. Somewhere outside the iron doors a single bird, a black one, the kind that had not sung at this keep in 2 centuries, opened its throat at the first light and sang 1 short clean note. Then she walked past him. She walked the long stone floor alone. She walked to the iron doors. She opened them with both hands. She stepped into the courtyard. The first dawn light was just touching the top of the keep. She lifted her face into it. She had tamed the bloodlust. The court behind her had bowed. And the king, still on his knee, had bowed lowest. Dawn came slow that morning. The kind of dawn that takes its time because nothing in the keep is in a hurry anymore. Leora walked across the courtyard alone. She walked past the dry fountain. The fountain had begun to fill. Not with water from the old pipes, which had been dry for 2 centuries, but with rainwater from somewhere under the stones. She walked past the rose garden. The black roses had opened all the way for the first time since her grandmother's day. She walked into the chapel where no one had prayed in 200 years. The chapel had 3 benches and a small stone altar, and 1 round window high up that let in a circle of dawn light the size of a dinner plate. She pulled the chalk from her sleeve. She wrote on the stone wall above the empty altar. She wrote 1 sentence in plain hunter's script. She wrote, "The covenant is kept." She stepped back and looked at it. She did not need to write more. She set the chalk down on the altar. She walked out of the chapel into the morning. The king was waiting for her at the chapel door. He stood 3 paces back. He did not speak. He did not kneel again. The kneeling had been done in front of the court. The kneeling did not need to be done again. He simply walked beside her at her left shoulder. The way a guard walks. The way a son walks beside his mother. The way a man walks beside the only person in the world who has the right to tell him to stop. They walked the long path back to the iron gate. The gate was open now. The chain lay coiled on the stone. The 2 ravens carved into the bars looked older than they had the night she arrived. She stopped at the gate. She did not step through it. She turned and faced the keep. The advisors were lined up on the long path behind the king. The duchess was at the front of them. They were waiting to see what she would do. Leora pulled the chalk from her sleeve 1 more time. She bent down and wrote on the stone of the gate itself. She wrote, "No wagon enters this gate again." She straightened up. The duchess read the line. The duchess passed it back to the advisors. The advisors passed it back to the servants. The servants passed it back to the lowest of the bonded. By the time the line reached the blood cellar, the whole keep knew. No more wagons. No more girls. No more empty dresses folded by the door. The bloodlust would not be fed from the village again. Leora walked back up the path with the king at her left shoulder. They walked past the chapel and the roses and the fountain and into the throne hall. The black oak chair was empty. She did not sit in it. She walked to the long table. She pulled out the chair at the head. She sat. The king sat at her right. The advisors filed in. The duchess took her old place. The court of dead things took their places behind them. And the covenant held. The bloodlust did not return the way it had been before. It still rose in the king at the dark of every moon. Leora always knew when. She would take the iron flask from her belt. She would unstopper it. She would draw a small clean cut across the inside of her wrist with the hunter's blade her mother had given her. She would let exactly 9 drops fall into the flask. She would cork it. She would hand it to him. He would drink what was in it. He would not take more. He would bow his head 1/2 inch. And then they would sit together at the long table until the bell rang for dawn. The village down the road slept easy for the first time in 800 years. The mothers began to name their daughters again. The priests blessed the road. The weavers wove new dresses. The wagon driver who had carried Leora to the gate sold his wagon to a hay farmer and bought a small house with a green door. The head councilman planted a row of apple trees along the path that no one had dared walk for 2 centuries. The children who had never been allowed near the iron gate were taught a new game. They would walk to the bend in the road, lay 1 small white stone on the wall and walk home. By the end of that first summer, there were 900 white stones along the wall, and not one mother had lost a daughter. And every now and then, on a quiet evening, a child would ask the old grandmother by the fire how the curse of the iron gate had ended. The grandmother would set down her sewing. She would look at the fire for a long moment. And she would say, "A girl walked through the gate one night with 1 good eye and no voice, and a small iron flask in her left hand." She would say, "The king bowed to her in front of his whole court." She would say, "That is how a covenant works when a mother seals it right." Then she would pick up her sewing again. And the child would listen to the wind at the window and think about the iron flask and the chalk and the 9 drops. And the fire would burn down low. And the old story would keep itself. The way old stories do. Down at the iron gate, the 2 ravens carved into the bars still watch the empty road. They are waiting for nothing now. There is nothing left to wait for. The wagons do not come anymore. The chain that once held the gate locked is gone. The villagers took it down one apple harvest and cut it into small links and sold them as charms in the next town over. A link of that chain is supposed to keep a daughter safe. The mothers say it works. The fathers say nothing, which is how fathers agree. And inside, at the long stone table, the lady of the house sits at the head and the king sits at her right. The advisors no longer argue with her decisions. The duchess teaches her the old songs that the consorts used to sing in the chapel before the bloodlust took them all. The lady writes the songs in her hunter's blue book in chalk that she sharpens every evening with the little blade her mother gave her. Sometimes, late at night, the king reads the songs over her shoulder and bows his head 1/2 inch the way he did the first night, and she does not look up from the page because she does not need to. She knows where he is. She knows what he is. She knows what holds him. And the bloodlust is kept. And the court bows. And no one bows lower than the king.